I've pinned the most chilling and terrifying stories I've ever heard on this map. Today I'll share one of them with you. The sirens of police cars were approaching my remote hunting lodge on the outskirts of Portland. I continued to sit in the corner of the room, clutching my head, feeling nothing, neither the foul smells around me nor the piercing cold. My eyes were veiled with tears, leaving wet traces, and it seemed they would never end. But the voices, those were what troubled me the most, eating me from the inside. Numerous voices whispered to me about the terrible crimes committed against them, begging for help. These voices created an unbearable cacophony in my head, and it felt like it was about to explode. I groaned loudly, begging the voices to finally quiet down, but it was all in vain. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Here came his reckoning for my 7 murders. It all started in childhood. At first, it was quite joyful and carefree. My father was a police captain, and my mother was a lecturer at one of the local universities. Despite their frequent busyness, my parents always found time to be with me, giving love and care. I often remembered the warm summer evenings when my father would come home after a long day at work, and we would play together in the yard. Weekends were a special time for our family. We often went out of town to a cozy hunting lodge, spent time in nature, where my father taught me to fish, and my mother taught me to recognize plants and flowers. But one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary morning when my father, as usual, was getting ready for work. I would always remember the smile with which he promised us he would return from work, but this time he did not keep his promise. That day my father did not come home. The tragic news of my father's death shattered what was once called a family. My mother, who had always been strong and calm, suddenly looked tired and confused. She couldn't find explanations for why and how it happened. Official versions spoke of an accident while on duty, but with each of her looks I saw that it was all a lie. It ate me from the inside. The grief and immense sorrow inside me seemed to punch a huge hole, and suddenly the world around me changed. The world, which was once full of love and care, suddenly became cold and incomprehensible, and that was when I started hearing the voices. The first time it happened was after my father's funeral. At first it was a light whisper, like the rustling of leaves, so I didn't pay attention to it. But at home, I realized that this noise not only didn't stop, but gradually became clearer and more insistent, as if someone was standing nearby and whispering something incomprehensible in my ear. A few evenings later, left alone, I suddenly realized that the whisper had become louder and clearer, and then I froze, shocked by what I heard. It was my father's voice, deep and penetrating. Cold sweat covered my forehead. My father's voice made me look around in fear, but there was no one in the room. And then I heard the words that made my blood run cold. It was not an accident. It was all planned. Panic gripped me, twisting everything inside into a tight knot. My father's voice, so familiar and at the same time frightening, sounded right in my head, whispering the terrible truth about his murder. As my mother suspected, he was framed by his colleagues and eliminated as if on duty. I couldn't believe it. It seemed I was going crazy from the loss of my father, but his voice did not subside, persistently repeating the same thing, and I began to believe what I heard. From this, I felt incredible joy. I felt as if my father was with me again. So I decided to tell my mother everything. I hoped she would be happy too, but she didn't believe me, attributing it to the result of the loss. But when I got to the details of my father's murder, she seemed to freeze, and the plate fell from her hands, shattering. Her face turned pale, her eyes widened in horror. Suddenly, my mother nervously pressed her hand to her chest, trying to compose herself. Her voice trembled as she said, "Rupert, this can't be true. You're just imagining it because of the stress." But I continued. I tried to convey the terrible truth, urging her to take some action, but she nervously ran her hand through her hair, as if trying to drive away unwanted thoughts. "No, Rupert," she repeated, now more sharply. "You're just tired and upset. It's all in your imagination." After this conversation, she seemed to close in on herself, drowning in her own grief. She avoided talking about it, trying to hide her pain and fear behind a mask of indifference. Meanwhile, I did not stop talking about my father, hoping that she would understand me. But this scared her even more, so one day she couldn't stand these conversations and made an appointment for me with a psychotherapist. The doctor diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress and prescribed medication, as well as further visits to the doctor. But the voice did not disappear. It continued to whisper to me about betrayal, danger, and the need to find the truth about my father's death. And after that, I realized that no one would believe me, not even those I trusted the most. However, each repetition of the voice intensified the pain and confusion, which led to the birth of something else, a deep, uncontrollable anger. This anger flared up like a fire, gradually consuming my consciousness. I could no longer perceive the world as before. Each day was filled with the desire to find out the truth and avenge my father's death. This desire became more and more obsessive, haunting me even in my dreams. A few months later, Dolores entered our lives, a housekeeper hired by my mother. But I quickly realized the true reason for her presence. She was hired primarily to take care of me, as advised by the doctors. And with Dolores' arrival, things indeed became easier, even cozier. One day, however, Dolores arrived late and was very upset. Her eyes were red from crying, and her gaze was full of pain and sorrow. And that was when I heard another voice, a woman's voice, gentle but with a clear Spanish accent. Sitting next to Dolores in the kitchen, I suddenly heard, "I miss you too, Hermanita. Forgive me for everything." And before I could think, I said, "She misses you too, Dolores." Dolores flinched at my words and sharply raised her head, taking a deep breath. For a moment she froze, looking at me with undisguised surprise and confusion. "So you already know," she whispered. "Mom must have told you. My sister passed away last night." Her voice trembled and tears began to roll down her cheeks again. "Thank you for your support." I saw her pain, and my heart grew heavy again. I wanted to hug Dolores, to support her, as I now knew how deeply the loss of a loved one hurts. And just as I opened my mouth to express my condolences, her sister's voice spoke to me again. "The blue folder behind the painting. The blue folder behind the painting." After this, an incredibly strong headache engulfed my head, as if someone was driving a nail into my temple. It grew stronger, spreading from the back of my head to my forehead, causing pulsating waves of unbearable burning pressure. The feeling of nausea made me bend over, clutching my stomach, and I felt everything inside me tighten with spasms. With each passing second, the dizziness grew stronger, and everything blurred before my eyes. I felt as if my legs could no longer support me, and I struggled to stay upright. Suddenly, I felt the warm hands of Dolores, whom I had almost forgotten. She caught me, helping me maintain my balance. Worry shone in her eyes. Dolores gently led me to the couch and laid me down, whispering soothing words, but I could barely hear her over the noise in my ears. My eyes began to close, and I felt my strength leaving me. The blue folder," I said with my last bit of strength. "Behind the painting. The blue folder." Dolores looked at me intently, as if trying to understand what I was talking about. But after a few seconds, her expression turned to shock, and I realized she knew what I was referring to. So, making sure I was okay, Dolores said she would be gone for an hour and literally ran out of the house. She returned a couple of hours later. She came to my room and sat next to me on the bed. Dolores nervously twisted her cross in her fingers and watched me anxiously. I could read fear in her eyes. You didn't learn about my sister's death from Mom, did you?" Dolores asked, swallowing a lump in her throat. I just nodded silently and looked at her other hand, specifically at what she was holding. It was a blue folder. I was sure this was the folder her sister had been trying to tell me about. Suddenly, I felt a strange cold envelop my body, and at that moment, Dolores' sister's whisper disappeared. I felt as if she was no longer there. She had gone, vanished, having conveyed the information to her sister, and was now free. At the same time, my father's voice grew stronger, causing new spasms of headache. It was a reminder that I couldn't simply forget what had happened to him. That evening, I stood in my room looking at myself in the mirror, but it seemed that I saw someone else in the reflection. The look in the reflection, determined and full of anger, spoke for itself. At the same time, my father's voice grew stronger than ever, reminding me of the need to solve the mystery of his death. The one who killed my father had to be found and held accountable. This certainty grew, turning into anger fueled by inner pain with each passing day. Over time, the desire for justice turned into a terrible desire for revenge for the unjust act of violence that took my father's life. Hatred for those behind this crime became the driving force for action. I could no longer stand by and watch as the truth continued to be hidden behind layers of vile lies. So now I had a new goal. I had to take the life of the one who took my father's life. The first few years were the hardest. I had to hide my feelings and thoughts while constantly feeling the pressure of my father's voice, reminding me of the duty to find his killer. So I began searching for and studying any information about my father's work and his colleagues. I spent all my free time reading police reports, documents, and old newspaper articles. Every step had to be thought out and aimed at getting closer to solving the mystery of my father's death. But the deeper I delved into the dark waters of the investigation, the more the darkness enveloped me. Feelings of hatred and anger filled my heart like black smoke, suffocating me. The decision for retribution did not come easily. Every time I thought about what I had to do, I felt an internal struggle within myself. But hatred and the thirst for revenge were stronger than any moral doubts. So I carefully planned my actions, studying all possible options for carrying out my revenge. When I was finally ready, I didn't notice how much the darkness had taken over me. I became cold and ruthless, ready to do anything to carry out my revenge. That night, heading to the house of my father's killer, I felt the anger and hatred inside me turning into a force that drove me to act. This was the moment of truth, the moment when I had to complete my mission and punish the guilty. So I waited until night enveloped the city in darkness. Knowing Darwin's schedule, I approached his house just as he was returning from work. As soon as Darwin approached the door, I rushed at him, quickly pulling a bag over his head. Darwin tried to fight back, but I was ready for this, both physically and mentally. After immobilizing Darwin, I dragged him to the car I had left nearby, then drove him to a pre-selected location, the family hunting lodge, which no one had visited for quite some time except me. Once there, I dragged him inside the lodge, where a room had already been prepared according to my plan. There, I removed the bag from Darwin's head, allowing him to finally see who was in front of him. His emotions and his gaze brought me a separate satisfaction. First shock, then fear in his eyes, but this did not stop me. On the contrary, it only strengthened my resolve. "Do you remember my father, Darwin?" I asked with a cold smile, looking straight into my victim's eyes. "He trusted you, and you betrayed and killed him." He immediately began to deny it, trying to justify himself, but I wasn't listening. I had made my decision long ago. In a moment, the silver blade in my hand cast a glint on the man. I gripped the handle tightly, as if pouring all the hatred and pain accumulated over the years into the knife. "Now you will get what you deserve," Rupert said before taking the final step. I stood before the man, who was tightly bound to a chair. The room was dimly lit, with only one faint beam of light falling on his face. The perpetrator looked exhausted, and his eyes were filled with fear and despair. This made me pause for a moment. Events from the past seemed to flash before my eyes. A shattered childhood, the loss of my father, years of anger and pain. I remembered standing by my father's grave and felt my heart tighten with tension. Was I really ready to become a killer? Was this truly the only way to achieve justice? The remnants of doubt inside me gave me no peace, but when I looked at Darwin, it was as if I was transported back to the past. All those painful memories returned, and my heart filled with resolve once again. This moment was changing me forever, but there was no turning back. I took a deep breath. My hands trembled with tension, but I forced myself to calm down. The time had come. "You took everything from me, and for that, I will take your life." I slowly raised the hand holding the weapon. My movements were focused and confident. Darwin tried to recoil from me, but it was in vain. The ropes held him too tightly. The entire room became a silent witness to our encounter. He tried to say something, but I was no longer listening. The world seemed to stop, and the only sound was my heartbeat, loudly marking the final moments of his life. I focused on my breathing, trying to stay calm. My hand no longer trembled. My resolve strengthened, and I took the decisive step. In an instant, everything changed. The room remained as quiet as before, but the weight on my shoulders began to lift. Now it was a different story, a story of restoring justice that would stay with me forever. When it was all over, I discarded the knife and stepped aside. My strength seemed to leave me, and I sank to the floor beside him. My body trembled from tension and emotions, but when I closed my eyes, I only saw my father's face, satisfied and grateful. His voice was gone, and I knew I would never hear it again. But that was for the best. It meant I had completed the task. I had helped my father. With a satisfied smile, I enjoyed the calming silence that surrounded me. But the temporary peace was soon replaced by a swarm of thoughts. I remembered that the job wasn't finished. There was still one thing left: to get rid of the evidence of the crime. I got up from the floor, my legs still trembling from the tension. A deep breath helped me calm down a bit. I focused on the plan, detailed, meticulously prepared. I had to act quickly and confidently to leave no trace. The first step was to prepare the body for transportation. Carefully, almost mechanically, I gathered everything I needed. Cautiously, to leave no traces, I wrapped the body in the tarp I had prepared in advance. Every move was thought out, every step calculated. No traces, no accidental details that could give me away. I carried the body to the car's trunk. The route to the abandoned quarry lay through several little-known roads that were rarely used. This route was chosen deliberately. I had studied it carefully to avoid unwanted encounters and surveillance cameras. It was important not to attract attention. Forgetting about fatigue, I focused on the road. Every turn, every intersection was familiar. I had driven these roads many times, practicing and studying all possible options. Every meter was important. Every detail mattered. After several hours of driving under the cover of night, I finally reached my destination. The quarry was remote, abandoned, and surrounded by dense forest, just what I needed. Opening the trunk, I unloaded the body. It was heavy, but adrenaline and motivation gave me strength. I carefully carried it to the quarry, away from prying eyes. The next step was to destroy other evidence. I thoroughly cleaned the car, removing all possible traces. Then I destroyed the tarp and all the items that could indicate my presence here. The fire consumed everything without a trace, leaving only ashes behind. After completing the final preparations, I inspected the place one last time. Everything was perfect, a place where no one would find any clues. Only darkness and silence were witnesses to my actions. With relief, I returned to the car. The roar of the engine woke me from my thoughts. Now I was ready to return home, leaving this place forever. One thought was in my head. It was over. I had done it. Peace and quiet enveloped me like a blanket. Perhaps this darkness that had consumed me for years was my destiny. From this, I felt a strange satisfaction, like the completion of a great task that had long awaited its time. A few days later, when I came to my senses after what I had done, I heard the voices again. This time there were several, each trying to reach me, but it was in vain. Their voices created a heavy cacophony of sounds that caused only discomfort and severe pain. Hoping to ease the pain, I quickly gathered myself and hurried outside. The headache was so intense that it darkened my vision. I was barely walking towards the nearest pharmacy when I felt a strong push on my shoulder. I had bumped into a man walking towards me. He apologized with an embarrassed smile and hurried on, and I suddenly froze. It seemed to me that I knew this man. I had to know him. And as soon as he disappeared around the corner, I saw a small silhouette in the crowd. Among the adults, it was so tiny that at first I thought it was a shadow, but then I realized it was a little girl, dressed in a dark blue dress. The girl raised her tiny hand and pointed in the direction the stranger had gone, and one of the voices in my head immediately sounded louder than the others. He heard me, and no one believed me. Everyone at school laughed at me. My parents didn't believe me. Now I'm gone, and he continues to do it. After these words, the girl disappeared into the crowd, and I continued to stand, frozen. The shock of what I had seen gripped my body, and then the familiar anger and hatred crept into my heart. New voices. I felt that I had to do something to avenge the little girl, so I first decided to learn more about this girl and her tormentor. I was ready to plunge into the darkness again, just to stop this horror and punish the tormentor. The tormentor turned out to be her school teacher, and from this information, hatred and the thirst for revenge flared up with new strength. So the next day, when the school was almost empty, I ambushed the teacher at the bus stop. Under the cover of darkness, I knocked him out, quickly tied his hands and feet, and loaded him into my car. I tried to be as careful as possible, leaving no traces that could link me to this crime. Then I took him to the hunting lodge, which had already become my secret hideout from prying eyes. When we arrived, I pulled the unconscious teacher out of the car and dragged him inside the lodge, where I had already prepared everything necessary. Placing the man on a chair facing me, I secured him with straps. When he finally came to, I began to interrogate him, wanting to hear a confession. But no matter how much the teacher denied his guilt, it wouldn't have changed my decision. I already knew the whole truth. After finishing the interrogation and hearing the teacher's quiet sobs, I realized it was time to act. The darkness crept up from the deepest corners of my soul, urging me to act. So I took out the familiar knife, and suddenly my hand trembled, my vision blurred. Now it was as if I was watching everything from the side, and my body was controlled by an unknown force, a force that wanted blood, and I began to act. The darkness filled my thoughts deeper and deeper, and every movement seemed heavy and blurred. The sense of reality left me, like water leaking from a cracked jug. I clearly felt the trembling in my hand and my heart starting to beat faster. The unknown force controlling my body seemed to grow stronger. The teacher cried, his quiet sobs echoing in the room, but his face blurred before my eyes. I saw only a hazy figure, blurred and motionless. Every sound of his pain penetrated my consciousness like cold blades, making my heart clench even tighter. I felt the knife weighing down my hand. Its cold metal seemed to draw me to it, making me feel part of something bigger, darker. My hand rose, and every movement felt heavy and inevitable, as if I were resisting a powerful current. The teacher's eyes widened as he saw me approaching. His panicked gaze pierced me, but my emotions were detached like an observer's. I was just a tool, part of this cruel ritual that my soul and body performed together. When the knife finally reached its target, I felt my body tremble with intense excitement and fear. The sensation was like plunging into icy water, shocking and piercing. Every minute felt like an eternity, and every movement was inevitable. The teacher's body went limp, and when his eyes closed, I felt the darkness gradually recede. It was as if there wasn't enough air, and the frantic beating of my heart echoed throughout my body. So, feeling the need for a breath of fresh air, I left the room and stepped onto the porch of the house. Sitting on the floor, I raised my hands and curiously examined my fingers. The darkness had receded, but I continued to feel an incredible power, a control over human life. I felt as if I had become a completely different person, one who had accepted his fate and would do anything to help other souls whispering their terrible stories. I was ready to act further, to become a guide for those who needed my help to find peace. I had no strength left to hide the body, so I left the victim in the same small room. I barely made it to the bedroom, where I collapsed into sleep, and it was a pleasant sleep, bringing relief and peace, but I did not yet suspect that this might be the last time I would know peace. The morning greeted me with pain. A terrible ache from 100 screaming voices seemed to pierce my brain like needles, making it hard to breathe. After a few minutes, I managed to isolate one of the most persistent voices. It led me to a new target, a chef who worked in a small restaurant and loved to cook at home for those dissatisfied with his menu. By the afternoon, after just a cup of coffee, I had another victim, a florist who decided to get rid of her rival by slipping her poisoned tea. It was strange, as I had never had multiple victims at once, although my mind told me to prepare first. The darkness in my soul whispered that it had to be done immediately. The same incredible energy I felt yesterday seemed to vibrate at my fingertips. It was intoxicating, a driving force I couldn't resist. So in the evening, I was already waiting outside the shop, carefully watching the young florist. She was unaware of the danger, calmly walking home after her workday. As she passed by a narrow alley, I instantly emerged from the darkness and grabbed her, covering her mouth with my hand. She started to struggle, but I was much stronger. Restraining her struggles, I dragged her back into the alley where my car was waiting. I opened the car door and forcefully shoved her inside. She cried and tried to plead for help, but I felt no pity. The darkness consumed me with every second, leaving no room for compassion. So I tied her up, taped her mouth shut, and set off for the hideout. During the drive to the hunting cabin, the girl continued to fight but gradually lost strength. I barely reacted. I was immersed in my own thoughts. I understood that the darkness was taking over my consciousness, blending the desire for revenge and the pleasure of having power over another's life. But it was a pleasant feeling, leaving a bittersweet aftertaste, and I couldn't help but enjoy it. Arriving before Sunday morning, I brought the already inconvenient florist into the middle. I quickly threw them into the frame, and then opened the doors of the small room, which turned into a makeshift torture chamber. After this, I carefully secured the girl to the top, without depriving myself of the chance of leaking. Then it was up to the cook, and then it was necessary to put together just a little bit. Having deprived the florist of a room, I headed to the restaurant where the victim was standing. In the dark at night, I realized the end of my shift, and when I noticed that the staff had begun to leave, I stopped at the courtyard. As only in my opinion, having consumed the man I needed, I forcefully hit him on the head with a bullet, and without a trace, I sprawled on the asphalt. Having loaded the cook, we headed home, relishing the thoughts of what was to come, and from this a feeling of a little restlessness appeared. Well, it didn't grow far because the darkness in the middle quickly extinguished all doubts. After returning home, I repeated the same with the cook as with the florist, immobilized him by tying him to a chair. I kept repeating that they are murderers, and I am only acting as an instrument of revenge. At that moment, the girl came to her senses and started crying again, trying to free herself, but the cable ties only dug into her skin and left traces. After that, I began the plan of action, and I started with the florist. I watched with morbid pleasure as she cried and begged to be let go. She begged because she thought she had done nothing wrong, but it was too late to repent. Without removing the smile from my face, I took action, and the girl's screams were my reward. They seemed to tell me when I was on the right track, and when I needed to change tactics. I so wanted them to feel pain, the same pain their victims felt before they became nothing more than a cold reminder in the form of a tombstone. When the girl was finished, it was the cook's turn. He was so scared that he couldn't help himself and literally wet his pants. The unpleasant stench made me cringe, and I made a mental note to ventilate the room well. After that, I took one of the largest kitchen knives and approached the bound man. There were a little more problems with him. And then with the girl, the extra weight was a bit of a hindrance, but it did not stop me. On the contrary, difficulties inspired me. I felt crazy but extremely satisfied. The crimson liquid splashed in different directions, leaving dark trails. For a moment, I looked at the way she left ruby reflections on me, and it seemed to me a real art, inspiring. So without stopping there, I grabbed the chair and pulled the cook's body closer to me. My hands were crimson, as was the knife in my hand, but they no longer trembled. The darkness within me demanded more, and I was ready to meet its needs. Every step, every cut brought the mission closer to completion. Leaving the remains in their places, I trudged to the bathroom. The sudden fatigue almost knocked me off my feet, so I grabbed the sink with both hands to stay upright. But what I saw in the mirror made me slide down onto the cold tiles. A shiver ran through my body as I saw my face. It seemed foreign. The wild look and stained skin frightened me. For the first time, I felt not only relief, but also fear of what I had done. The pleasure from the act made my body tremble, causing nausea. An idea formed in my head to stop all this, to end my horrific actions before it was too late. For the first time in years, I thought that it wasn't up to me to decide others' fates. Perhaps what I once considered a gift was actually a curse, but the voices wanted something entirely different. Sensing my doubts, my weakness, they began to chatter louder, as if trying to suppress my ability to think. My brain burned from the loud chatter, and from the pain I literally screamed, then vomited everything I had in my stomach at that moment. The voices continued to press on my consciousness. They begged and commanded, reminding me of the cruel moments of their deaths. Enough, I pleaded with the voices. It seemed I had no other choice but to succumb to the pressure of the darkness and the voices, and when I gave in, they seemed to quiet down. I exhaled with relief and closed my eyes, falling into unconsciousness right on the cold bathroom floor. I woke up again from the persistent chatter in my head. Even more voices seemed to be trying to reach the man I would listen to first. Rising, I slowly took off my clothes and without looking at my reflection, began to tidy myself up. Each pang of conscience was met with sharp pain in my head. Fear choked me from the start, so I just followed the voices in the darkness. Without looking back at the bodies in the living room, I hurried to prepare for the meeting with new victims, the ones the voices had already whispered to me. They led me to the lawyer, about whom several victims in my head were murmuring. The voices whispered that this man had destroyed many lives with his corrupt actions and manipulations in court. So I decided that this man should be the next victim. I quickly realized that the best way to get to the lawyer was to take advantage of the moment when he would be alone in his office late at night. I seemed to know that the lawyer often stayed late at work, so I prepared to act at that time. But as I was getting ready, I slowly realized that it wasn't really me preparing, but the darkness inside me. It was as if I was being controlled, and I could only blindly follow the instructions whispered by the voices. So in the evening, when the lawyer stayed late in the office, I entered the building, taking advantage of the minimal security and the fact that the employees had already left. I sneaked into the lawyer's office, holding a small knife. Silently opening the door, I entered the office. The lawyer looked up and only managed to shout, "Who are you?" But it was too late. Rupert quickly approached him and delivered several precise blows. The lawyer tried to defend himself, but I was much stronger and more determined. I was precise and clear, leaving the lawyer no chance of escape. After the lawyer stopped breathing, I again felt a mixed sense of horror, disgust, and satisfaction. Leaving the body in the lawyer's chair, I carefully wiped the knife blade in my hands, removing traces of my presence to reduce the chance of being caught. I left the body at the desk, surrounded by stained documents scattered as a result of the lawyer's attempts to escape death. Making sure no one would notice me, I left the lawyer's office, feeling a strange pleasure from my action. The darkness inside was satisfied. The voices became quieter, but now I understood that it was temporary. This force controlled me, and it was only a matter of time before I heard a new voice whispering about the next target. This time the voice appeared quite quickly. It was a young girl whispering in my mind about her psychologist. Instead of helping her, this man caused irreparable harm, both physically and mentally, driving her to suicide. He was one of the lawyer's clients whom I had killed. That's probably why the new target appeared so quickly. Sitting behind the wheel of my car, my body suddenly began to tremble. Part of me no longer wanted to kill. It made me feel dirty, as if crimson rivers were flowing down my arms, and the metallic salty taste lingered on my tongue. I realized that now it felt like captivity, and the gift had become a curse. Unfortunately, I didn't see how in my own revenge I had become so closely tied to the darkness that it had now become part of my heart. I wanted to resist this force, but I only suffered defeat, wasting my own strength in vain. And now I could only watch the events unfold. Now I seemed to be another person again. I watched as my body started the car, feeling like a stranger in my own body, a captive observer. I moved towards the psychologist's house where he lived with his wife and daughter. Taking an axe, I knocked on the door. I no longer wanted to be careful. The thirst for darkness was so strong that it was impossible to think of anything but murder. A woman in her 50s opened the door. I froze for a moment, carefully examining the psychologist's wife, and suddenly an image of my mother appeared before my eyes. After my father's death, she never recovered. She immersed herself more and more in work or other activities, anything to spend less time at home. I, on the other hand, became more and more focused on future revenge, and therefore did not interfere with her. So she distanced herself from me, even though I desperately needed her support, love, and help. Perhaps she was afraid of what was happening to me and of the fact that I occasionally muttered in my sleep. So when I finished school and left the parental home, my mother distanced herself even more and visited me as rarely as possible. Feelings of loneliness and anger towards my own mother filled me, becoming a trigger and prompted further actions. Looking at the stranger with a gaze full of hatred, I swung the axe. The familiar crimson liquid splashed in all directions, and I again felt the metallic taste on my lips. Pushing the body inside, I entered the house and locked the door. "Marge, who is it?" a voice suddenly called from the second floor. I looked up, glanced at the stairs, and quickly went upstairs. I found my victim in bed, reading the Washington Post. He froze when he looked up, then rushed to the drawer in search of a weapon. But I caught up with him in a few steps and struck him as hard as I could. The blow landed on the psychologist's shoulder, followed immediately by a wild scream of pain. The man howled, clutching the drawer for support, but couldn't hold on and fell to the floor. He turned his head and looked at me one last time before I could deliver another blow. I watched in fascination as the liquid flooded everything around, but hearing the creak of the floor, I suddenly remembered the daughter who lived with her parents. After inspecting the house, I noted with a mixture of relief and regret that there was no one else there. As I left the house, I suddenly saw a shadow in the house next door. Someone was peering out the window, holding a mobile phone. Cursing, I had to hurry to the car and, barely starting the engine, drove away. I didn't know who else had heard the screams. Perhaps the neighbors had already reported to the police. Nervously drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, I thought about what to do next. I needed to escape, to get as far away from here as possible. Or maybe surrendering to justice wasn't such a bad prospect. Perhaps they would help me stop, and the darkness would retreat, and finally I could breathe easily. My thoughts were interrupted by a searing pain in my temples. Roaring, I lost control of the car and veered off the road. Barely unbuckling my seatbelt, I jumped out of the car. My legs gave way, and I fell to the ground, feeling the excruciating pain twisting my entire body, taking over every cell. I began to gasp for air and clung to the rocks in agony, as if trying to stay conscious. Suddenly, through the noise in my head, I heard a voice, not in my head, but the voice of a living person. Looking up, I saw a young man in front of me. He asked if he could help me, but upon meeting my gaze, he stepped back. The voices continued to buzz. "Kill, kill, crush the freak," they commanded. This time they weren't talking about a crime. I was sure this stranger hadn't done anything wrong, but the voices wanted death. The darkness wanted blood. So getting up, I silently looked at the guy. He gasped, seeing my blood-stained face and body. Then he bolted and ran towards the forest. The chase was short. I quickly caught up with the stranger and tackled him to the ground. The fight began instantly, each of us trying to gain the upper hand. The stranger seemed to have the strength of youth, but I acted with a brutal determination that was hard to match. He dodged blows. The guy tried to fight back, but with each passing second, his resistance weakened under the relentless assault. When the young man ended up on his back, I had to act quickly. I grabbed a nearby stone and, not giving my opponent time to recover, raised it above my head. I met his gaze without any pity. In his eyes, a mix of doom and a plea for mercy. At that moment, something seemed to break inside me. The darkness that had tightly wrapped me in a cocoon of hatred and anger seemed to crack, and I felt shame and pain for my actions. So, with trembling hands, I dropped the stone and almost fell off the stranger, collapsing to the ground. Shocked, we stared at each other, as if not believing what had happened to us. After that, the guy got up from the ground and quickly ran towards the city. I felt deep pain and remorse, realizing that I had almost killed an innocent person. Questions arose in my mind that I had no answers to. Why did I allow the darkness to take root so deeply within me? How could I be so cruel? Now I felt the voices in my head trying to subdue me again, to make me justify my actions, but this time I resisted with all my might. I no longer wanted to be a puppet in the hands of darkness, so I tried with incredible effort to block the voices. Feelings of guilt and pain overwhelmed me, but I knew I had to stop all my horrors. Deciding that I could no longer stay in this place, I headed to my hunting cabin. It stood alone deep in the forest, far from people, and reminded me of peaceful days spent surrounded by nature. The road to the cabin was difficult and required my concentration, but the voices in my head grew louder, like the echo of darkness that didn't want to let me go. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees ominously rustling in the wind, their branches reaching out to me as if trying to hold me back. Each mile felt heavier, and eventually I began to see silhouettes behind the trees. They emerged from the darkness only to disappear before my eyes, their shadows moving silently and elusively. I felt their presence like a cold breath on my back, and every time I tried to quicken my pace, they seemed to get closer. The voices in my head grew louder, turning each of my thoughts into a chaotic whirlwind, pulling me deeper into the abyss. When I finally saw my cabin, my strength left me. I entered, closing the door behind me, trying to shut out the world that was chasing me. But the voices didn't stop. They only grew louder, whispering to me about everything I had done, making me feel guilt and despair. In the darkness of my cabin, I realized there was nowhere left to run. I had to fight what was inside me, the darkness that haunted me, and only then could I find peace. But as I walked into the small room, I froze. He watched in horror at what he had done, and his heart sank, his stomach clenching in spasms. I felt nauseous. A strong wave of nausea engulfed me, making me clutch my stomach. I felt the food rising up, and I immediately doubled over, shaking all over. The sensation of my own vomiting was terrible, but even worse was the realization of what I had ultimately done. The sight before my eyes made my heart clench with horror and disgust at myself. I began to cry. Tears streamed down my cheeks, mixing with the sweat and dirt from the fight. I sobbed, realizing the magnitude of my actions, and felt the darkness inside me swelling, causing incredible pain. The voices in my head screamed, filling every thought, every corner of my consciousness. Screaming in pain, I rushed to the victims to cut the ties that bound them to the chairs. The bodies fell heavily to the floor, creating a gruesome sight. I sank to my knees beside them, then crawled into the corner of the room. I couldn't stop my sobbing. The despair and pain I felt were unbearable. The voices wouldn't stop, and the darkness that had once given me strength now seemed like an insurmountable burden. I sat in the corner of the room surrounded by the bodies of those I had killed, and continued to cry, realizing that my soul was forever changed by these horrific acts. I didn't know what to do next until I suddenly heard the wail of police sirens. I didn't know that one of the psychologist's neighbors had called the police, complaining about suspicious sounds and screams. The police quickly responded to the call, sending a patrol to investigate. Thanks to eyewitness accounts and the description of the car, the police began their search. They tracked the car using surveillance cameras and traffic records that indicated the direction to follow. At the same time, a report of the lawyer's murder came in, and thanks to surveillance cameras, the police realized that these two horrific murders were committed by the same person. After several hours of intense searching, they found a trail that led them to a remote hunting cabin in the forest. Upon arrival, the police saw the car parked near the building. They surrounded the cabin and began to approach cautiously, ready for any surprises. But when they entered the cabin, they were met only by the horrific smell of death. The police found me in a small room sitting in the corner, crying. Around me were the bodies of my victims, the teacher, the florist, the cook, and the young man. The police quickly assessed the situation and arrested me. I didn't resist, surrendering completely and accepting my fate. My hands trembled, and my face was covered in tears. The police led me out of the cabin into the light of the patrol car headlights. Suddenly, the pain in my body stopped. The voices became quieter again, and the darkness receded. Despite the circumstances, I felt a strange emptiness and a sense of relief. There was no anger, no thirst for blood. There was guilt, sadness, relief, and peace. And from this, a small smile appeared on my lips. The police were horrified by what had happened. They could never have believed that someone who looked like me on the outside was capable of such acts. A man who once seemed like an ordinary resident had turned into a ruthless killer. All this time, my appearance seemed perfectly inconspicuous, and no suspicion fell on me. In court, I decided to tell the truth. I described each murder, starting with the policeman, my father's killer, and indicated where to find his body. Then I spoke about the voices and the force that had driven me to act since my teenage years. This deeply shocked everyone present. I described how the darkness and the voices I heard controlled my actions, forcing me to commit horrific murders. My mother, whom I hadn't seen in a long time, was also called to testify, but she came only once to give her testimony. She looked devastated and couldn't bring herself to look at me even once. When I saw her in the courtroom, my heart sank. I hoped her presence might bring some comfort. or at least understanding. However, her gaze fixed on the floor and her unwillingness to make eye contact silently spoke of the deep chasm that had grown between us. I continued to look at my mother with pain in my heart. Her detachment was a stronger blow to me than all the previous events combined. The feeling of loneliness and alienation that I had always felt now became unbearable. I realized that I had lost my mother for good, along with any hope of reconciliation with her. This encounter only intensified my sense of guilt and the realization of the scale of my actions. I understood that I had not only destroyed my own life, but also my mother's, forcing her to bear the burden of my crimes. This realization was unbearable, and tears streamed down my face as I silently looked at her, hoping for a glimpse of humanity that never came. I continued to sit in the corner, broken and resigned to my fate, understanding that I was now completely alone, even in the presence of my mother. Her testimony was brief and sad, and after that, she never appeared in the courtroom again. The trial was long and painful. My testimony shocked not only the court, but also the public. The defense continued to argue that I had become a symbol of how the human psyche can break under the pressure of inner demons. But even at that moment, as I told my story, I felt a certain relief, as if the confession freed me from part of the horror I had experienced. When the judge read the verdict, declaring me mentally ill and sentencing me to life in a psychiatric hospital, I felt a mixed sense of relief and fear. On one hand, it meant that I would no longer be held accountable for my actions as a conscious murderer. On the other hand, I understood that my life would now be confined to the walls of the hospital, and the darkness that consumed me might never retreat. I fell to my knees, covering my face with my hands. My body trembled with nervous tension. The voices in my head fell silent for a moment, but I knew they would never completely disappear. Tears streamed down my face, mingling with the feeling of inner emptiness. In those moments, when I realized that my sentence was a lifetime imprisonment in my own mind, I felt a part of my soul disappear forever. Immediately after the court session, I was taken to a psychiatric hospital. It felt as if time had stopped, and I couldn't understand what lay ahead. The hospital was a gloomy building with high walls and iron gates. When I entered, I was greeted by cold, sterile corridors that stretched endlessly. At first, I felt shock and anxiety. Everything around seemed foreign and hostile. The voices in my head hadn't disappeared. They continued to whisper, sometimes even scream, disturbing my consciousness. The darkness that had always been with me now felt more aggressive, as if trying to regain control over my mind and body. In the first days at the hospital, I constantly felt fear and tension. The voices incessantly reminded me of what I had done, and that I had to continue my mission. The darkness, which had always been a part of me, now became my only companion. It surrounded me like a thick fog, giving me no peace. However, over time, under the influence of medication and therapy, the voices became quieter, though they didn't disappear completely. The darkness receded, but I understood that it would never leave me entirely. I began to realize that the struggle with this inside me would last a lifetime. The feelings of guilt and horror for my actions also didn't leave me. I felt trapped in my own mind, haunted by images of the victims and the whispers of invisible phantoms. Each day in the hospital was a battle with myself, an attempt to find peace and forgiveness that I couldn't give myself. I had few visitors. Dolores, an old acquaintance, occasionally visited me, telling me about life outside the hospital. She spoke about my mother, who never came to see me, leaving me with an even greater sense of loneliness. Dolores always brought a bit of light into my dark world, although I knew that this world would never be the same. Besides Dolores, a strange woman would visit me, always holding a toy bear with an old pink bow around its neck. The bear must have once belonged to a little girl. This woman would sit next to me and silently look at me, as if trying to understand my inner pain and torment. I never asked who she was, but it seemed as if I understood. She was the mother of that little girl. Days passed, and the voices in my head didn't quiet down. They still whispered their terrifying stories, causing a sense of losing control. I knew that the darkness inside wouldn't disappear as long as I lived. Eventually, I realized that the only way to find peace and freedom from the darkness was to die. One evening, when everything was quiet, I took the final step towards my release. Gathering my last strength, I wrapped a cord around my neck and began to pull. The darkness inside me fought in its last attempts to survive. The voices screamed, trying to stop me, but I remained determined. I felt myself gradually leaving this world, and with it, the voices and darkness faded. My struggle was ending, and finally it brought a happy smile to my face until the moment when, in the last moments of my existence, I felt the ghostly touches of hands on my legs, as if the orderlies were trying to save me and pull me from the clutches of sweet death. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist, and oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter, just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice. All for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.